Welcome to the Jesus Movement Live. It's wonderful to be back. We've had a holiday and a rest. So tonight we carry on with our series, A Journey to Faith. As the screen behind me says, tonight's lesson is called Shealtiel and God's Plan for the Babylonian Exiles. So we move into this new phase, which is kind of not so well known in the Bible, because Shealtiel is actually the son of King Jehoiachin, who's the last king named in the genealogy of Jesus. So I'm going to start by giving you some background with some charts and tables so you can fill in who he is and where this journey is going now. So we'll just start off with this screen. So we've just finished up with Jehoiachin, and he was followed by King Zedekiah, and here we arrive now at Shealtiel. So Shealtiel is known as what's called an exilarch, which is a king in exile. Okay, so he never got to rule because he was in exile, and in fact he will never actually get to rule, but that's what an exilarch is known as. Now, at this point in time, King Nebuchadnezzar is ruling over the Babylonian Empire, and the Persian Empire hasn't commenced at this point in time. There's activity that's happening, but they haven't actually started it as an empire. We're going to the next page. This is a bit of a refresh. I'll just start over this side. When we looked at King Jehoiachin, King Jehoiachin ruled for 11 years. Now the Bible tells us that there's a period of Babylonian rule for 70 years, which we explained is often a misnomer because it gets taken as 70 years of exile. But you'll see from this information that it's not possible, and this is the reason why. In 605 BC, King Jehoiachin was actually taken off to Babylon, and with him his royal family and the nobility went, and included with those was of course Daniel. So that was in 605 BC. In December of 598 BC, we find that King Jehoiachin was returned back to the kingdom of Judah to rule, and at this point in time he's in fact killed, and his life doesn't end up well. He gets dragged outside by like a donkey, and his body is left outside the gates of Jerusalem. So when this happens in 598 BC, the Bible tells us that there was 3,023 Jews taken into exile, and we get into this language now of Jews because a person from Judah is a Jew. That's what it means, people of Judah. And so we find the Bible changes language, and God, in fact, when he speaks to the prophets, starts to use the word Jews. And so we find here only a family went the first time, the nobility and the family. This time there was 3,023 Jews taken into exile. Then when his son comes to rule after him, he only ruled for 3 months and 10 days. And so in that period of time, so we move on now just to March in 597 BC, King Jehoiachin, December 598 BC. And so he's actually taken into captivity with his family, his nobles, attendants, and there was 10,000 exiles. And so amongst them is the person we're talking about tonight, and that is Shealtiel, who is the eldest son of King Jehoiachin. And then I'll just swap sides over here. Once King Jehoiachin was taken away, his uncle, who is of course King Jehoiachin's brother, he then ruled for 11 years, and we find in the end that his family is actually murdered. He has his eyes taken out, and he's taken away in chains to Babylon. This happens in 587 BC, the 9th of Tammuz. That's actually halfway between June and July. And we find the Bible tells us that with them there was 832 people taken from Jerusalem. And so if you actually look at these numbers, you start to realise there's not many people involved. And so when you add them all up, we find that the Jewish exiles are taken to Babylon across a 19-year period. And so there was 70 years of exile. That means that there would be a rolling period of when people went back. And so that's not the case. It's not what the Bible says. And so this whole historical period means across 19 years there's various exiles taken to Babylon. When we add up the numbers from this, we find that the total exiles actually only number approximately 14,000 people, just under. And so we find that the community is actually really small. How many people went into Israel when they came out of the desert from Egyptian captivity? You know, the Bible tells us roughly 1 million, but we're talking about men that were 20 years and older. So when we add all society together, they estimate it's between 2 to 2.5 million with children, grandparents, etc. And so we find that there's only 14,000 taken, and then there's a remnant that's left in the land. So the numbers are actually really, really small. So all of the activities that happened before when they came and overtook Judah earlier, and they besieged and took over all the towns and they killed all the people, the reality is there was not many people left. And so it sort of brings to life what the prophet Jeremiah said, because he was saying that I want you to go to the land, build your houses, grow your crops, and to prosper. Basically, he wants them to have children, because and the Bible actually says to have lots of children. In other words, they want to grow the numbers to bring them back. Here's the reason why: there was hardly any people. And so we find when we start looking at the numbers and the dates, it paints a very vivid picture of what's actually happened. And so Babylonian rule, as I've mentioned, it's 70 years because it started in October 609 BC when the Assyrians were defeated in Karshemish, and it will continue until October 539 BC when the Babylonian rule will come to an end at the hand of the Medo-Persian Empire, ruled by King Cyrus the Great, who releases the Jews to go back to Jerusalem. And so you can see it's so specific, 70 years, that it's actually from October to October, exactly 70 years. And so this is the period of time that Jeremiah is talking about. Okay. Now on this chart, it's a bit detailed to see, and we're going to break it down as we go. But all the descendants on this side, this is the gospel according to Luke. And we end up with Joseph and Mary on one side. This side here is the period of kings. Before here we come to Shealtiel, and it passes through the different descendants until we get down to Jacob, Joseph, and of course the birth of Jesus himself. Okay, so we've been following the genealogy of Jesus in the book of Matthew, so we're actually following this line here. And when we get to Shealtiel, if you look at the colours across here, you'll see that the people who are ruling are only the Babylonians. So the period of King Cyrus the Great with the Persian Empire, which is in this row here, they don't start to come into effect until the time of Zerubbabel, who will be the leader who brings the first exiles back from Babylon. So this is just a bit of an oversight. Over on this side, we have the history of all of the Arab vassal nations on this side, and we'll come across that as we will. And here we have the Greek Empire, which starts later on. Of course, what happens with these empires is they're all there, but they're only kingdoms. And then as the weakening of one comes through and the next comes through, all of these lines of rulers are actually fulfilling the prophetic words of that Daniel spoke when Nebuchadnezzar had his visions. And we're going to cover a couple more of those tonight. So basically, as I've got up on this side here, the genealogy of Jesus can be divided into three periods. Part one is from God's call to Abraham through to kingship, so the time of King David. Part two, from kingship to captivity, Babylonian exile. And so now we enter into part three, from kings to Christ, and we enter into this period of the Bible in which there is a lack of information. When we go through all these different books of the Persian Empire, you realise that most of the books that are left in the Bible now are concerning the Persian Empire. If you think of the book of Esther, Persian Empire. The book of Nehemiah, Persian Empire. Okay, so some of these stories that we know well and they get preached about are concerning the Persian Empire, but once the Persians go, there's virtually no more information in the Bible itself. And so the only information we have are the prophetic words of Daniel. And we start aligning all of the historical events with the Greeks into what actually happens. And we're going to explain a little bit about that tonight. Now this chart here, this is a closer and simpler chart because it's cleaner. And basically these are the descendants again. So here's the gospel according to Matthew, and here's the gospel according to Luke. Now when we look at this, we can see there's a difference in the number of descendants. So there's those who say, see, that's proof that they can't be true. The other problem is that we have the name of Shealtiel and Zerubbabel. They turn up in both lines, but they're at different historical points. And so again, people say, well, this mustn't be right. What you have to remember is actually, if you go down through this list, you'll see names like Nahum, the name of a prophet, Amos, the name of a prophet, Joseph, one of the sons of Jacob, Levi. So all of these names recur. So it's not a surprise in reality that these names come up, because they would have been names that were used and popular at the time. And they're also names of people who were actually important people in the biblical journey. So the other thing which this doesn't account for is how long does each person live for? We can all know that someone can live for 80 years and someone could live for 40 years. And so the fact that there's more descendants on one than the other doesn't necessarily mean that there's this massive difference in terms of genealogy. It just means simply that some of the descendants don't live as long. And we find that, for example, with the Egyptian pharaohs. We find that when Joseph ruled, there was a change of multiple pharaohs, for example. Not everybody's lifespan is the same. And so we'll come back to the details of this later on. Okay, I'll leave that picture up and we'll get underway with the story itself. So it's just a bit of background to put a bit of context to the journey we've been on so far, and also to have a bit of understanding for where we're up to now. So Shealtiel is exiled as a family member of the royal house of Judah to Babylon by order of King Nebuchadnezzar II after the first siege of Jerusalem in 597 BC. In the kingdom of Judah, Shealtiel is actually the heir apparent to the throne, which we don't hear in the Bible because it never happened, but that's who he was. But when he was brought into captivity by the Babylonians, he is a prince, and so he would have been what was known, as I mentioned, as the next exilarch, or the next king-in-exile after his father, King Jehoiachin. So what we have to understand here is that Shealtiel was only a very young infant when he was taken into exile. So Shealtiel, the reason we can know this is that if we actually look at the ages of the kings, so King Jehoiachin, for example, he was actually the son of King Jehoiachin. And so when he took over the throne, he was very young, which means he wouldn't have been married for long, which means that his children wouldn't have been very old. So we can know that his children were very young at this point in time. So Shealtiel's experience would have been without knowledge. He wouldn't have really known what was going on at the age that he was. So he would have had little memory of what happened in the kingdom of Judah. His father, as we've mentioned, succeeded his grandfather, King Jehoiachin, to become king after raiding forces. The Bible tells us in 2 Kings chapter 24, from Babylon, Syria, Moab and Ammon invaded Jerusalem and killed him. So that's in verse 2 of 2 Kings 24. We have covered this before, it's just a bit of background. So just 3 months and 10 days later, though, the armies of the Babylonian Empire came again and laid siege. King Nebuchadnezzar himself came up to the city, and his father, it says in 2 Kings 24, verses 10 to 12, Jehoiachin, his mother, his attendants, his nobles, and his officials all surrendered to him. Amongst them was Daniel, and also the 3 men who became administrators for Babylon, which we've already spoken about. So this took place in spring on the 16th of March in 597 BC, and he was exiled and carried with his parents and the people from Jerusalem into Babylonian exile. The people from Judah formed a long procession, and their treasures from the temple of the Lord and the royal palace were carried by donkeys or pulled on carts. Remember, this isn't the point in time where Jerusalem was destroyed. This comes a bit later, and we will cover that tonight. When Jehoiachin was taken, Jerusalem was not destroyed. He was deposed, and King Zedekiah, his uncle, who was formerly known as Mattaniah, was put into rule instead. So when he arrived in Babylon, it was a major city with a large number of people, and they would have cheered their captors as they led 10,000 of his fellow countrymen through the Ishtar gate and down the processional way. So this picture behind me, we've put it up before, but this is the Babylonian city. This is the Ishtar gate here. This is the Tower of Babel in the background, and this is the main course, which they call the processional way, in which all the people would gather when there was something important that was happening. So you can imagine when their king returned home with the army, with prisoners from other countries, the crowds would have come out to see exactly what was happening. So Shealtiel would have experienced something like this when he arrived with his family. Now, all of the treasures that were taken with them, they were taken to the temple called Ezekiel, and we'll touch on that a bit later. And the treasures would have been dedicated to their god, who was called, anyone remember? With Nebuchadnezzar, he was called Marduk, M-A-R-D-U-K. Okay, so they're in the prophecies with Daniel. So the soldiers that came with them would have been conscripted into the army. The artisans and the craftsmen would have been put to work, and the ordinary people were sent away from the city to work the fertile land fed by the Euphrates River. You remember last lesson we talked about Ezekiel, and it talks about how they went down the Kebar River. The Kebar River is actually a canal or a waterway, and that's where they stayed, and that's where Jeremiah sent the message to them to build their homes, farm their crops, and so on. So Shealtiel, of course, as a son of a king, a prince, he wouldn't have been sent away. He would have been kept in the palace, probably in the dungeons or a suitable quarantined area. So they would have been completely restricted in what they could do, and he would have learnt very quickly what it meant to be captive and not free. Now, at this point in time, interestingly, and putting this in context, is there was a governor of Babylon at the time when he arrived, and we find that that governor is going to be Daniel. Remember? And his name was Belshazzar. And so the three court officials, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, were all formerly Jewish exiles as well. And so the picture we're painting now is when they went there, is that we've got Daniel upstairs, we've got the three fellows who are doing administration work, and then downstairs, so to speak, we've got Jehoiachin and his family who are imprisoned. Later on, of course, when the other king comes, Zedekiah, he will be joining them. Okay, so we're just trying to paint a start-up picture for Shealtiel. So we're going to go now to the book of Jeremiah, and we're going to go to chapter 52 to start off tonight. So Jeremiah chapter 52, and the first verse is from verse 12. So we're going to be telling the whole story, is literally going to come out of the prophets as we found over the previous few lessons. So Jeremiah chapter 52 verse 12, and it reads, "On the 10th day of the 5th month, in the 19th year of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon." Okay, so we're identifying a time and a measure. Now, he had a commander called Nebuzaradan, and he was the commander of Babylon's imperial guard, and he was the one who went to Jerusalem with the whole Babylonian army. They went to the temple, and it says that one of the tasks that he had was actually to break up the temple. And one of the specific tasks was to break up the two bronze pillars that supported the portico at the front entrance. So I have a beautiful illustration here which shows what they looked like, and this was their job, to remove these two pillars. And as I continue to describe, you find that they were there to take the sea as well and various other articles away. So they were breaking it all up because it was so large, in order to take it back to Babylon. And so this was the commander. So what this is telling us is that Nebuchadnezzar's not there. He sent a commander for this work to be done. Now in Jeremiah 52 verses 18 to 19, it says, "They also took away the pots, shovels, wick trimmers, sprinkling bowls, dishes, and all the bronze articles used in the temple service. The commander of the imperial guard took away the basins, censers, sprinkling bowls, pots, lampstands, dishes and bowls used for drink offerings, all that were made of pure gold and silver." So in other words, they went about salvaging anything that they had perceived value in. So after salvaging everything of value, Nebuzaradan set fire to every important building, the temple of the Lord, the royal palace, and even all the houses of Jerusalem. Finally, he broke down the city walls, and the devastation was complete. So Nebuzaradan took Sariah the chief priest, Zephaniah the next high-ranking priest, and 3 doorkeepers from the temple captive. And before I go any further, I have a nice illustration as well, pictorial illustration of what it looked like when he went back. And so in this instance, they actually destroyed the city walls, they destroyed all the main buildings, they destroyed the temple and set fire to it. So when they left on this occasion, we find that Jerusalem really has been turned to rubble. And so this is the circumstance that's happening. So from the city, he took the officer who was in charge of the fighting men, 7 royal advisors, the secretary responsible for conscripting the people of Israel, the land, and 60 of his men. He also took some of the poorest people, the rest of the craftsmen, and any who had gone over to the king of Babylon during the siege. You may remember in the previous lesson, people were given the opportunity during the rule of King Zedekiah, the last king, and previous kings, that if they wanted to go over to the Babylonians, that's actually what God asked them to do. He said that he was going to take care of them and prosper them. Right? But those who remained behind as a remnant, he said that they would die by sword, famine, or plague. And so we find here that this is being enacted. But those who had come over were okay. So some people were left behind, and they were some of the poorest who had never owned anything. And now these men, women and children were actually given the vineyards and the fields to support themselves. So the things that were outside of the city, they then inherited. They were not completely left to their own devices though, for King Nebuchadnezzar appointed a governor called Gedaliah, son of Ahikam, the son of Shaphan, to be over them. So there's no more kings, he's now appointed a governor. Now in Jeremiah 39 verse 12, so we're going to read some scripture from 39 and then from Jeremiah 40, we find that King Nebuchadnezzar knew of the prophet Jeremiah, and he'd given orders to Nebuzaradan. So Jeremiah 39 verse 12, he actually says to him, "Take him and look after him, don't harm him, but do for him whatever he asks." So if we look at this, what does that tell us about what God's doing? He's protecting, he's being so specific. King Nebuchadnezzar is telling the commander of his imperial guard not to hurt the prophet Jeremiah, and he knows who he is. Quite extraordinary, isn't it? And so God said that he was using Nebuchadnezzar to do his work. And this commander speaks the same, which we're going to cover in some scripture just now. So before the palace was destroyed and torched, Jeremiah, remember where was Jeremiah? Does anyone remember?
He was thrown in a pit.
He was thrown in a pit, which was the water cistern with the mud at the bottom, but he had actually been removed, but he was contained in a courtyard for some period of time. He was locked in a courtyard. And so when they went there, they specifically went to the guard's courtyard and turned over to the newly appointed governor Gedaliah to be taken back to his home in the territory of Benjamin. Okay, so this is Jeremiah. For this reason, he was with the exiles from Jerusalem and Judah, being taken north to the Babylonian king's encampment in Riblah of Hamath. So remember, they have a staging post at Hamath further north when they're going across to Babylon. And so what would happen is when he took everybody out, he took Jeremiah with him, but not to take all the way to Babylon, but just to make sure he got home okay. And so this is part of Jeremiah's journey. So when the exiles, the captives and their captors reached Ramah, Nebuzaradan found Jeremiah bound in chains among the other captives, and he said to him, so we're going to Jeremiah chapter 40, verses 2 to 4. Jeremiah 40, verses 2 to 4. So this is, remember, the commander of Babylon's imperial guard speaking. He said, the Lord your God decreed this disaster for this place. So there's no perchance going on here. We see that God's hand is very firmly on everything that's actually happened. Remember, God said to Jeremiah, there's going to be lots of things that come against you, but don't worry, you'll survive it all. So in other words, it's going to be rough, but you're going to be okay. And so we find here, after all of what happened with Zedekiah, we find that the commander knows who he is, and he says, the Lord your God decreed this disaster for this place, telling him that he's actually acting on the instructions of God through his king Nebuchadnezzar. It reads on, and now the Lord has brought it about. He has done just as he said he would. All this happened because you people sinned against the Lord and did not obey him. So he's giving them judgment. He's telling them why it actually happened. But today I am freeing you from the chains on your wrists. Come with me to Babylon if you like, and I will look after you. But if you do not want to, then don't come. He's giving him a free will choice. Look, the whole country lies before you. Go wherever you please. And so Jeremiah is now freer under the Babylonian imperial guard commander than he's ever been in his own country under his own kings. Quite extraordinary. So Jeremiah, however, did not choose to go with the commander to Babylon, but before he turned to go, Nebuzaradan said to him in verse 5, go back to Gedaliah, son of Ahikam, the son of Shaphan, whom the king of Babylon has appointed over the towns of Judah, and live with him among the people, or go anywhere else you please. So he's saying, well, if you don't want to come with us, you can go back to your governor, or again, you can live wherever you like. At this, the Babylonian commander gave him some provisions, a present, and let him go. Jeremiah went to the new governor, Gedaliah, at Mizpah, and stayed with him and the poor people left behind by the Babylonians. So we know from this and Jeremiah's decision that he understood that he was being placed with the people who were to remain behind, to be God's spokesperson to them. Why? Why would he do that? Isn't it all over? Remember, he's a spokesperson. He's commissioned by God to speak God's words to his people.
Well, God always gives you chances, second chances. And the fact is that Daniel, another prophet, is already
on the other side, and so is Ezekiel. So God is a merciful and loving God, and no matter what is going on, he still says that anybody who wants to go across to the Babylonian side will be free. And so Jeremiah continues to stand in this side of things, and he continues to do the Lord's work, even though everything has gone. So when Nebuzaradan arrived at Riblah in the land of Hamath, going north with the last of the people, Seraiah the chief priest, Zephaniah the next high-ranking priest, the 3 temple doorkeepers, the officer in charge of Judah's fighting men, the 7 royal advisors, the secretary responsible for conscripting the people of the land, and his 60 men were all executed by the king of Babylon. So in other words, these people did not submit. They were part of the former rule of Zedekiah, and so Nebuchadnezzar fulfilled what God said would happen to them, and they were all killed. And there was only a few people left alive, and this is where we find in Jeremiah, if we skip up to chapter 52 again, verse 29, it tells us that there was 832 people from Jerusalem. So the last batch of exiles, which we showed on the screen a bit earlier, there was only 832 left who were then taken to Babylon. Remember the previous batch of people, there was 10,000. And prior to that, there was only small numbers as well. One batch of 3,023. And in the beginning with Daniel, only the nobility and the royal family. And so at this point in time, the Bible closes that chapter of taking people into exile, and that's the last numbers the Bible gives us that tells us how many were actually taken. Okay, so now we find the same situation happens again. King Nebuchadnezzar had another procession down the processional way. His army had just returned from what they called Hatti land, H-A-T-T-I, is what the Babylonians called it, and that included the former kingdom of Judah. So once again, a crowd of people lined the street and they looked down from above. And so that picture I had up earlier, we pop it up again. And so the last batch of people were being brought in down the processional way. Now, when these last people were brought in, King Jehoiachin has been there for almost 11 years, which means that Shealtiel now is a adolescent boy. So he's more cognizant of what's actually going on. And so he would have been there when Zedekiah was taken there with his eyes removed and the last of the exiles were to come in. And so he would have been fully aware of what was going on. As I've written here, a man was being led in front of the procession, dragged by a chain and manacled with bronze shackles, but noticeably he was blind. So this is Zedekiah. He was dirty, his clothes were tattered, but there was something about him, and his father would have had to explain to him who he was because it was his uncle. It was the great uncle of Shealtiel that he saw. So he probably had the first recognisable time that he actually saw him. So we're talking now from Shealtiel's perspective. So it was at 587 BC at this stage. Zedekiah had arrived in chains, and another member of his family humiliated and tormented before the people of Babylon. Remember the prophecies that were given early about the kings to David? Every generation there would be a violent occurrence where people, members of the family, were killed, people were going to be put into captivity and so forth. So we find those prophecies are being fulfilled as well. So here's the picture now. We've got Daniel, known as Belshazzar, upstairs in the palace. Right? We've got King Jehoiachin and his uncle downstairs in the dungeon. One can see, one's blind. Jehoiachin's family are with him. Zedekiah's family are not with him because they were all put to death. And so that's the circumstance for the Jewish people in the city of Babylon. We've got the three administrators there. And so Daniel's sitting there governing the land as the local king of that region. Meanwhile, further south, all of these exiles, these new exiles, 832, they would have been taken down to the Kabar River, to the canals. It's about 50 miles or 80 kilometres south of Babylon. And they were put onto the land to farm the land and to prosper. And they were going to be part of those who would have children who would come back to Jerusalem one day. These people were not going to make it back to Jerusalem. Okay? So it's the next generation. So now in the second year of King Nebuchadnezzar's reign, so we're going back a little bit for a moment, long before Shealtiel had arrived in Babylon, the Jewish exile Daniel had interpreted a dream or a vision of the king when no other could. Although Daniel made it clear that it was God in heaven who reveals mysteries, the Babylonian king acknowledged him for his perceived wisdom and not only put him in charge of all the other wise men of Babylon, but as I said, he made him the ruler or governor over the entire province of Babylon. Many years later, the king has another dream or vision, and he again seeks Daniel's interpretation. Does anyone have any memory for what that dream was? What's the next one he has?
Well, it's not the hand, is it?
It's not the hand. It's not the hand. So that's the handwriting on the wall.
Yeah.
That's going to come later. But Nebuchadnezzar has another dream. I'll put a picture up. It'll make it easy for you. It's a dream of a tree that gets cut down. It has a band of iron and bronze put around it, and King Nebuchadnezzar goes crazy. And so this is what we're going to talk about now. So this is happening while Shealtiel, the next descendant in the genealogy of Jesus, is in Babylon. Okay? So we're going to go now to the book of Daniel. So we're going to read a fair few scriptures from Daniel. So the first scripture, we're going to go to chapter 4. We've already looked at Daniel 1, 2 and 3. And so now we go to Daniel chapter 4. So even though we're looking at this descendant who doesn't appear to have his own story in the Bible has a story that envelopes him. And this is how we're going to travel through the rest of the Bible now. Because the journey continues on. These people are alive. They lived during these times, and this is the experience that they actually have. Okay, so Daniel chapter 4 verse 1. This dream was much later because the king addressed his entire empire. So take notice of this, not just his own kingdom. So when he had his first dream, he was only a king of Babylon. Now he's a king of the Babylonian Empire. And so he says, to the peoples, nations and men of every language who live in all the world. Remember what he said? I actually spoke about it not from the Bible, from extra biblical information from ancient Babylon. He actually said that he was going to take over all the world. And so when he speaks, he talks about people who live in all the world. The Bible agrees with what the extra biblical information was from ancient Babylon. So let's see what happens. So King Nebuchadnezzar explains his dream or vision to Daniel. So we're going to go to verses 10 and 12 now, 10 through to 12. He says, I looked, and there before me stood a tree in the middle of the land. Its height was enormous. The tree grew large and strong, and its top touched the sky. It was visible to the ends of the earth. Its leaves were beautiful, its fruit abundant, and on it was food for all. Under it, the beasts of the field found shelter, and the birds of the air lived in its branches. From it, every creature was fed. And so the picture I've put up is of this huge tree. Okay, but as you can see, the story, the vision says there's fruit and all of the birds living in the branches, and from it every creature fed. So the king continued with more. So reading on from verses 13 to 15 now, it says, I looked, and there before me was a messenger, a holy one, coming down from heaven. He called in a loud voice, cut down the tree, trim off its branches, strip off its leaves, and scatter its fruit. Let the animals flee from under it, and the birds from its branches. But let the stump and its roots, bound with iron and bronze, remain in the ground, in the grass of the field. Any understanding yet where this is going?
Oh, he's the tree.
Right, remember King Nebuchadnezzar, remember the statue? The gold head was Nebuchadnezzar. The next, the chest was silver. The waist was bronze. The legs were iron. And the feet and toes were a mixture of iron and clay. And so he's talking here, when the tree is cut down, that what is it? It's a stump that has iron and bronze around it. So we're now talking about the future kingdoms that are left after the tree is cut off. So after declaring the tree of abundance be cut down and stripped, the holy messenger then said in verses 15 to 17, "Let him be drenched with the dew of heaven, and let him live with the animals among the plants of the earth. Let his mind be changed from that of a man, and let him be given the mind of an animal, till 7 times, or seasons, depending on your Bible version, pass by for him. The decision is announced by messengers, the holy ones declare the verdict, so that the living may know that the Most High is sovereign over the kingdoms of men, and gives them to anyone he wishes, and sets over them the lowliest of men." And so what this is telling us is the tree is cut down, but it's not dead. And so we get this message here about the 7 seasons. Let his mind be changed, and let him be given the mind of an animal. So Daniel answered King Nebuchadnezzar in verse 22, "You, O king, are that tree. You have become great and strong. Your greatness has grown until it reaches the sky, and your dominion extends to distant parts of the earth." So the fact that the birds were in the tree, it had the fruit, and the animals fed off it, means that he was the source of everything. It was his empire. He then interpreted the dream. So we're going to read verses 24 to 26. "This is the interpretation, O king, and this is the decree the Most High has issued against my lord the king. You will be driven away from people and will live with the wild animals. You will eat grass like cattle and be drenched with the dew of heaven. 7 times, or seasons, will pass by for you until you acknowledge that the Most High is sovereign over the kingdoms of men and gives them to anyone he wishes." So when they say 7 times or seasons, that means 7 years. If we just pick one season, winter, if it passes 7 times, it takes 7 years. Doesn't matter which season we pick. Okay? The command to leave the stump of the tree with its roots means that your kingdom will be restored to you when you acknowledge that heaven rules. Daniel gave some of his own advice and told the king to renounce his sins and do what is right if he wanted his prosperity to continue. So 1 year later, after he had this vision and the dream, and it was interpreted, the events came to pass. The king was walking on the roof of his palace when he said, now we're going to go to Daniel chapter 4 again, verse 30. When he said, "Is not this the great Babylon I have built as the royal residence by my mighty power?" So what does that say about Nebuchadnezzar? He's become prideful and arrogant, knowing full well, because we know from his commander, that they said that they are merely fulfilling God's work. And yet here he is now doing well a few years later, going, well, aren't I just so powerful? I'm the ruler of the world. And so his arrogance means that he's actually not obedient to God. He's not walking to God, with God. He's not listening to God. And so God is going to cut him down a peg, so to speak, literally. But as he finished speaking, the Bible tells us that his royal authority was taken from him. He was driven away from people, and he began to eat grass like cattle. Hence the picture. We see him here. There's the city of Babylon. There's Esagigli, which is the temple. And here is the 90-metre high statue, gold statue, on the plain of Dura outside the city. So this is the illustration that's here. So 7 seasons passed, and then his sanity was restored and his honour and splendour returned. His advisors and nobles found and restored him to the throne, and King Nebuchadnezzar became even greater than before. However, he was changed, because he praised, he honoured and glorified the God of Israel when he said in Daniel chapter 4 verses 34 to 35, "His dominion is an eternal dominion. His kingdom endures from generation to generation. All the peoples of the earth are regarded as nothing. He does as he pleases with the powers of heaven and the peoples of the earth." Now you might remember when Daniel was originally talking to him, the God of Israel was called the God of heaven. And so he saw the God of Israel as a deity that was representative of the God of heaven. That's why they didn't carry a statue with him, because you couldn't see him. Now he acknowledges that he's the God of all. And so his stance has changed through this experience. When all this had transpired, the king sent a letter throughout his empire and acknowledged the sovereignty of the Lord Almighty. So if we go to Daniel chapter 4 again, but we're going to go back to verses 2 to 3. Daniel 4 verses 2 to 3. And he said, "It is my pleasure to tell you about the miraculous signs and wonders that the Most High God has performed for me. How great are his signs, how mighty his wonders. His kingdom is an eternal kingdom. His dominion endures from generation to generation." So in other words, he's recognizing that there's experiences that he's had with God himself, where he now proclaims miraculous signs and wonders. There is one of note which we've covered in the biblical story, and that is the 3 gentlemen who went into the furnace. Nebuchadnezzar witnessed that, and he said, "Your God is more powerful than any other god." Right? And he also made a decree at that point in time that no one was to speak against the Jewish people, or they would be put to death and their families put to death and their homes would be destroyed. And so here he is now talking about miraculous signs and wonders. Now, the Holy Bible doesn't actually say when this occurred. You notice when you read the Bible, there's lots of segments of stories or events that happen, but you sort of think, well, how does that fit in with everything? Or when did it happen? What's the sequence of events? What's the purpose? They're all those sort of questions we look for. But there is actually a clue, and we're going to take a look. So in my research, between 582 and 575 BC, 7 years, there's actually an absence of any records or decrees by King Nebuchadnezzar. This is highly unusual because all ancient kings are known to either document or even embellish their achievements for posterity. They want to be known in future generations as this amazing, great, powerful king. Nebuchadnezzar would have been no different because he has records for all the other years, but 7 years exactly are missing. So it's quite extraordinary. So in the British Museum, however, there's a clay tablet. I'm going to put this up on the board now. It's called BM 34113. You know, there's literally thousands of tablets that have been found in ancient cities. These clay cuneiform tablets, the Babylonian Chronicles as they're known, there's something like 25,000 of them. They're little, they're only small, and they're all pressed in wet clay with this cuneiform script, and then when they're dry they become a permanent record. So one of them, they're all been numbered, and they're scattered amongst different museums around the world, unfortunately. But these are from the British Museum. It actually says, Nebuchadnezzar considered, his life appeared of no value to him. Well, that's pretty extraordinary. They're always telling you how wonderful and powerful they are. And the Babylonian speaks bad counsel to his son, evil Merodach. Now, funny, he turns up in the Bible, doesn't he? It's his son. Then he gives an entirely different order, but his son does not heed the word from his lips, nor do his courtiers. He does not show love to son and daughter. His family and clan do not exist. Well, we know that's not true. He had a family. So what is this talking about? He's gone mad. Nobody's listening to him. No one heeds what he says. He doesn't show any love. Well, he's out in the grass, eating grass, with the mentality of the animal, the Bible tells us. But he says on this tablet, his family and clan do not exist. In other words, it's as if he's not there, or they're not there. So in other words, he's not with them. His attention was not directed towards promoting the welfare of Ezekiel, that's the temple, which is part of the king's domain, and Babylon. He prays to the Lord of Lords. He raised his hands in supplication. He weeps bitterly to Marduk, the great God. His prayers go forth to. Now these little pieces here is because the tablets are damaged, so there's bits missing. But this tablet is written about this period of time in which there is no annual tablets being produced about the achievements of a mighty king. Remember, he's not just any king, he's a king of the Babylonian Empire. No records, and then this shows up. So obviously paints Nebuchadnezzar in a very different picture. Now just to sort of put sense to it, the tablet records that King Nebuchadnezzar considered that his life appeared of no value to him. He spoke bad counsel to his eldest son, Evil Merodach. And Evil Merodach, by the way, is named in Jeremiah chapter 52 verse 31, and also in 2 Kings chapter 25 verse 27. And he gave entirely different or contradictory orders that led both his sons and his courtiers not to accept his counsel. He showed no love to his son or daughter. He neglected his family, because the verse there says family and clan do not exist. And he no longer performed his duties as king. Why? Because his attention was not directed towards promoting the welfare of Ezekiel and Babylon. So Ezekiel was the principal temple in Babylon, as I mentioned, dedicated to their chief god Marduk. And so Nebuchadnezzar has gone mad. He's not there doing what he should be doing. The last 3 lines of the inscription switch from the king's actions to his beliefs. When it says he prayed and raised his hands in supplication to the Lord of Lords. In previous texts from tablets, he called the Lord of Lords is Marduk in his case. Right, he sees him as the greatest God. Why? Because he's the king of the whole empire. His God is the mightiest of all. So he is Lord over all the other Lord, or God over the other gods. But as it says there, he weeps with bitter tears. Clearly he was suffering and sought restoration from his God, but with none forthcoming. Perhaps that last line where it says, his prayers go forth to, which is missing, is to the God of Israel. This we'll never know from this clay tablet, but the Holy Bible says, going to Daniel chapter 4 verse 36 to 37, at the same time my sanity was restored, my honour and splendour were returned to me for the glory of my kingdom. My advisors and nobles sought me out, and I was restored to my throne and became even greater than before. Why? Why do you think he would say that? I became even greater than before. Any thoughts? Who was he worshipping before? Who's he worshipping now? So he's now greater than before. He's come to understand that the God of the universe, the Creator, is the God of Israel, of the Jewish people, of Daniel, who interpreted the very dreams for which he's now experiencing in real life. Goes on to say, now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and exalt and glorify the King of heaven. So again, that word heaven, when he talks about the God of Israel. Because everything he does is right and all his ways are just, and those who walk in pride he is able to humble. And those who walk in pride he is able to humble. What just happened to Nebuchadnezzar? He spent 7 years like an animal eating grass. He's been humble. His pride was so huge, he said, I'm such a great king of such mighty power, when he was on the palace walls. Now he's humbled, and he acknowledges that he has been humbled by the King of heaven. Very powerful message. So being that there is an absence of any records or decrees by King Nebuchadnezzar between 582 to 575 BC, and the clay tablet says his son Evil Merodach does not heed the word from his lips, nor do his courtiers, it is probable that the Babylonian Empire was administered by his son as regent with the help of the king advisors at court, hence their mention. They've turned from him. They would be the persons or the people he would normally talk to, and yet he's not. And so they would have discounted what he had to say because he's gone mad. Okay. So quite fascinating. Okay, so moving on the first day of the first month in 578 BC, the 27th year of the reign of King Nebuchadnezzar, the prophet Ezekiel received a word from the Lord. So we're going to go now to the book of Ezekiel. I'm sorry, I'm going to keep moving you through the books of the prophets. If nothing else, you're going to get used to moving your way through the Bible. I love seeing people with paper Bibles because it's good to get to know where these books are. But it's going to bring you closer to the prophetic words of the Bible. Now, I wrote a post on Facebook that talks about when Jesus spoke, if you actually listen to what he said that people mourned the lack of understanding of what the prophets had to say. And when Jesus was alive, he would talk all the time. You might recall, if you think about it, he would talk about the prophet said. The prophet said, I came to fulfill prophecy. Right? So he says that people don't know the prophets and don't know what they say and don't know what they forecast, so they don't understand what's going to happen in the future. And so one of the things that Jesus tells us is basically know your prophets, know what they have to say, because then you know what's to come and what has already been fulfilled. It is part of your journey as a Christian person to know what the prophets have to say. So if nothing else, I'm going to take you through all the prophets and you're going to hear what they have to say, and you're going to realise historically, step by step, everything that they prophesied came to pass. And history also records it and supports what the Bible says. And so going to Ezekiel now, chapter 29, verses 18 to 20, we're going to have a look at. It says, the word from the Lord that Ezekiel received, he said, Son of man, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, drove his army in a hard campaign against Tyre. Every head was rubbed bare and every shoulder made raw. Yet his army got no reward from the campaign he led against Tyre. Therefore, this is what the sovereign Lord says. Does everyone remember Tyre is the little island where King Hiram was the person who supplied the cedar logs to the temple? It's part of Lebanon today. Okay, so just to put some perspective, north of Israel. So the Lord says, I'm going to give Egypt to Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, and he will carry off its wealth. He will loot and plunder the land as pay for his army. I have given him Egypt as a reward for his efforts, because he and his army did it for me. Okay, so this is all happening during the life of Shealtiel. All these events are occurring. So God's plan is continuing to unfold. So I'll just put that map up behind me and I'll refer to it as I'm going along. So Gedaliah, he lived at Mizpah as the governor with a small contingent of Babylonian soldiers. And a remnant of people from the kingdom of Judah came to him. Now it was renamed the province of Judea under the rule of the Babylonians. So it was no longer a kingdom. And it was subject to Babylonian rule. When all the Jews that were scattered in Moab, Ammon, Edom and other countries heard that a remnant was living in Mizpah under the governor Gedaliah, they actually returned and joined in the bountiful harvest of wine and fruit left behind by those taken into exile. So you can imagine the scene. The rich, the wealthy, the skilled, the nobility have all been taken into exile. They're all the people that God wants. The poor, the remnant who didn't walk with God that were left behind, suddenly everyone's gone. And they rush back into the land and they go, fantastic. It's like looting and plunder, isn't it? I'm going to take that house. Look at the vineyard. I'll have that. Oh, look, there's fruit here. I'll eat that. And so this is the scene that's happening like a vacuum after the last exiles were taken away. Now 2 months later, Ishmael, son of Elishama, an officer of the former king with a royal bloodline, came to Mizpah with other army officers and their men who were still roaming free in the open country. What Gedaliah and the other army officers did not know, however, was that Ishmael had been sent by Baal-is, the king of Ammon, to assassinate Gedaliah and take captive the people left in the land. So you remember where the Ammonites were? The Ammonites are on this side over here, on the other side of the Jordan River. So they sent him to assassinate Gedaliah. He successfully assassinated him and set out to take the people to the Ammonites. But the other officers and the men caught up with him near the great pool in Gibeon. And so here is Gibeon on the map here. Mizpah and Gibeon are virtually the same spot. They're just north of Jerusalem itself. And so this is all happening here. Ishmael and his men were defeated in battle, and the captives were freed. Jeremiah the prophet was amongst them. So all this happened while he was there. Remember, he was with Gedaliah the governor, the Bible tells us. So because Ishmael, son of Elishama, assassinated the governor appointed by the king of Babylon, the army officers, their men, and the remnant people feared Babylonian retribution. So instead of returning to Mizpah, what do? They stopped at a place called Geruth Kimham near Bethlehem. So that's in Jeremiah 41 verse 17. So instead of going back up, they find themselves down here just next to Bethlehem. So they've gone southwards. And their plan was to flee to, anyone know? Where they're going to flee to? They're not going back. Where are they going to run? They're not going to go north. The Babylonians are north.
Egypt.
They're going to go to Egypt. That's right. And so if we go to if we go to Jeremiah 42 now, verses 2 to 3. So we're going to have a few scriptures from Jeremiah. So you turn your Bibles back to Jeremiah 42 verses 2 to 3. Jeremiah the prophet. Okay. So Johanan, son of Kareah, Jezaniah, son of Hashiah, and all the people from the least to the greatest approached Jeremiah the prophet and said to him, "Please hear our petition and pray to the Lord your God for this entire remnant. For as you now see, though we were once many, now only a few are left. Pray that the Lord your God will tell us where we should go and what we should do." And so all these people who had shunned Jeremiah and his prophetic words for all these years are now asking him to pray because they're destitute. So they're the remnant. We can see by the numbers that were taken to Babylon, there wasn't many people left. So the country's been devastated. It's worse than during the period of Judges. There's very few people actually left. And so they ask him to pray. So Jeremiah did pray, and 10 days later, the Lord told him to tell the others that they were to stay in the land, submit to the Babylonians. So remember what we said a bit earlier? The Lord is still merciful. He's telling them to submit to the Babylonians because he's going to take care of them and bring the next generation back. And it says he would restore them and protect them from King Nebuchadnezzar. He also told them, the God of Israel said, in Jeremiah 42 again, verses 15 to 16 this time, it says, "If you are determined to go to Egypt and you do go to settle there, then the sword you fear will overtake you there, and the famine you dread will follow you into Egypt, and there you will die." So there's a prophetic word for you. They went to Jeremiah, they asked him to pray for them, and the Lord responds and says, "Give yourselves up to the Babylonians. I'll make sure that King Nebuchadnezzar takes care of you. However, if you go south to Egypt, you're going to die." What would you do? Haven't they gone through a hard enough time to know that God is serious? And yet, what do? It's incredible, isn't it? The army officers refused to believe Jeremiah and told him he was lying. They claimed that Jeremiah's scribe, Baruch, son of Neriah, who had survived and still lived among the remnant, was inciting him to hand them over to the Babylonians. The army officers took the decision to disobey the Lord's command to stay and went down to Egypt. Ruled by Pharaoh Hophra, who had encouraged the former king Jehoiachin to revolt against the Babylonian Empire. So they thought it was a safe place to go because they had a pharaoh there whom their former king had formed an alliance with. So that was their rationale. Hophra's more powerful than God to these people. Right? This is basically what they're saying. So they travelled to the Nile Delta, where they were welcome to stay, and settled in a place called Tar Panhes. And this is that place here. So it's right on the eastern side of the Nile Delta, not far off the end of the Mediterranean Sea. So they came down from this place over in Bethlehem, followed down the way of the land of the Philistines, it's the highway. It was also called the way of Horus by the Egyptians going the other way. They passed through what's called Pelusium, Migdol, and down to Tar-Panhes, which is where they went. So when Jeremiah arrived there, the word of the Lord came to him, and he said in Jeremiah 43 now, verses 9 to 12, so 43 verses 9 to 12, while the Jews are watching. So can you take notice that this is quite significant? We mentioned this a couple of times, but in the Bible, until we get to this period of history where the exiles have actually gone from Judah, they were never called Jews in the Bible. And suddenly now, when Jeremiah is giving the word of the Lord is calling the remnant of his people, all the people in Babylon, Jews, meaning the people of Judah, where they formerly came from. Okay? So we see from this point in history onwards, the people that we call Jewish today are descendants from these times. Okay? So this is an important connection. So again, while the Jews are watching, take some large stones with you and bury them in clay in the brick pavement at the entrance to the Pharaoh's palace in Tar-Panhes. And so this is how we know exactly where they went to. Then say to them, this is what the Lord Almighty, the God of Israel, says, I will send for my servant Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon. Now this is really relevant right now because what happened? He'd already subjugated Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar had already said that he is the God of all. So he means that Nebuchadnezzar is now listening to God. He is obedient to God. So when God says, I'm going to send him, Nebuchadnezzar is going to go. Who do you think would have been passing the message from the Lord to Nebuchadnezzar? Daniel. Why? Because Daniel was in the palace ruling the land for him. Makes sense, doesn't it? So we start to see these connections coming to place and understand that even though not all of it's written in the Bible, the Lord had a plan and he placed Daniel there for a reason. And so this is now being enacted. So reading on, I will send for my servant Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, and I will set his throne over these stones I have buried here. He will spread his royal canopy above them. He will come and attack Egypt, bringing death to those destined for death, captivity to those destined for captivity, and the sword to those destined for the sword. He will set fire to the temples of the gods of Egypt. He will burn their temples and make their gods captive. And so that's interesting too, isn't it? Because what normally used to happen in the past is that if you went into a foreign land, they used to take their gods and they take them back to their own land. But here he's saying that Nebuchadnezzar will destroy their temples and set fire. So in other words, he's not taking them back. He doesn't believe they're gods anymore. And so we see a shift in what these ancient rulers would have normally done. And so the Bible gives us a great insight here. So when God's people first went into Egypt, I've just given you some reference here. Although God changed Jacob's name to Israel, the people were still known at that time as Hebrews, for they were the descendants of Abraham, who was from the other side of the Euphrates River, which is what Hebrew means. By the time they entered the land of Canaan, they were called Israelites, and when they united under an earthly king, the nation became known as the Kingdom of Israel. After the Kingdom of Israel split into two, the people who still call themselves Israelites, but they were either going to be the people of Israel, the kingdom to the north, or the people of Judah, the people to the south. Now that both kingdoms have been destroyed and their peoples have been carried away in exile, the people left behind in the newly named province of Judea under Babylonian rule were simply called the remnant of Judah. So in other words, they're no longer God's people. Remember, God said he would destroy them. If they didn't go to Babylon, there will be the end of them. So they're not even acknowledged as his people anymore. So we listen to the language and the words that are used, we get a good understanding. But now, of course, the remnant of Judah, what do? They flee to Egypt. And the rest of the people of Judah are held captive in Babylonian exile. The God of Israel begins to call them Jews, a name that means of the land of Judah. because they no longer live in the land of Judah. They're now of the land of Judah. This is where the origin of the name is. So this, in fact, as I've just mentioned, is the beginning of Judaism. Okay? So when we talk about religions today, we talk about Christians, Muslims, Judaism. So this is the birth of Judaism. For the people are no longer called Hebrews, nor are they called Israelites. So no further in the Bible will you hear the name Israelite or Hebrew at this point in time. So when the remnant of Judah arrived in this place called Tahpanhes, after all the devastation they had survived in Jerusalem or in the towns of Judah, they once again began to burn incense and worship other gods. The Lord's anger was fierce, and he gave a word to Jeremiah to give to them. So we're going to Jeremiah chapter 44. So Jeremiah 44. We've got verses 8 to 9 and verses 13 to 14. So we're going to read two sections there. So starting with Jeremiah 44 verses 8 to 9. Why provoke me to anger with what your hands have made, burning incense to other gods in Egypt where you have come to live? Have you forgotten the wickedness committed by your fathers and by the kings and queens of Judah, and the wickedness committed by you and your wives in the land of Judah and the streets of Jerusalem? Now 13 to 14. I will punish those who live in Egypt with the sword, famine and plague as I punished Jerusalem. None of the remnant of Judah who have gone to live in Egypt will escape or survive to return to the land of Judah, to which they long to return and live. None will return except a few fugitives. And so it's getting very, very clear and very, very specific. Now, every year at Passover, the people of Judah were reminded how God protected them and brought them out of bondage from Egyptian slavery. So you would think that they would never trust the Egyptians. I mean, their whole history, the thing that they're reminded, one of the most important things that they remember every year is being taken out of Egyptian slavery. And yet they're choosing to go back. And not just go back, but to worship other gods rather than submit to the Babylonians and face correction and protection from the Lord. So the Jewish remnant living in Egypt refused to listen to Jeremiah. So they say to him in verses 16 to 18, "We will not listen to the message you have spoken to us in the name of the Lord. We will certainly do everything we said we would. We will burn incense to the Queen of Heaven and will pour out drink offerings to her, just as we and our fathers, our kings and our officials did in the towns of Judah and the streets of Jerusalem. At that time we had plenty of food and we were well off and suffered no harm." They just don't get it, do they? It's quite extraordinary. "But ever since we stopped burning incense to the Queen of Heaven and pouring out drink offerings to her, we have had nothing and have been perishing by sword and famine." So in other words, they're actually saying the reason that all this is happening to them is not because of God, but because they stopped making offerings to this false goddess, the Queen of Heaven. How extraordinary. So Jeremiah not only reminded them why this was happening and again spoke of the fate that awaited them, but this time spoke of a sign by which they would be able to recognize that the Lord was punishing them. In other words, they didn't believe it, so here comes another one. So we're going to go to Jeremiah 44 verse 30, where Jeremiah says, "This is what the Lord says. I am going to hand Pharaoh Hophra, king of Egypt, over to his enemies who seek his life, just as I handed Zedekiah, king of Judah, over to Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, the enemy who was seeking his life." And so we see a parallel situation happening here. We've got the king of Egypt who they're actually going to for protection, and God says he's going to bring another king to take out the king that they seek protection from. Just as Zedekiah was handed over to Nebuchadnezzar because he sought protection from Pharaoh Hophra. Okay, so we've got the same situation happening again. Now earlier, when Pharaoh Hophra of Egypt had gone up to Jerusalem to support King Zedekiah, only to find that the Babylonians had left, he returned home and was forced to deal with a mutiny of soldiers. So this is the background story that comes to connect to the Bible. he was forced to deal with a mutiny of soldiers at a strategically important Aswan garrison on Egypt's southern border with Cush. This he contained. Okay, so I'm just going to change to another map here. And I have a slightly larger one again, but this is Aswan down the bottom. So this is where the first cataract is. South of here is Cush, Nubia, today's Sudan, and Upper Egypt here, Lower Egypt down to the Nile up there. So he's talking about this location here at Aswan. So Libya, Egypt's western neighbour on the southern coast of the Mediterranean Sea, so Libya's over here on this side, was suffering from incursions by Greek invaders called Dorians. So we start to hear about the Greeks now. So Pharaoh Hopra tried to protect them. His efforts were to no avail, and the Greeks mauled them at Cyrene in Libya. And when they returned home, his defeated army suffered a civil war between those who were indigenous soldiers and those who were foreign mercenaries. So in other words, putting the two parties together didn't go well. So the indigenous Egyptian soldiers believed they had been taken to Libya and betrayed, so that Pharaoh Hopra could exercise greater power by using the many Greek mercenaries in his army. They gave their support to Amasis II, a general who had served successfully under Pharaoh Hopra's father, Pharaoh Psamtik II. Okay. And so we've got these two pharaohs that were ruling in two locations in the Nile Delta. And so the power has been taken from one and given to another. This fulfills what Jeremiah says. This is actually what happened, how it happened. But Hopra fled to a foreign country. Ironically, you know where he fled to? Have a guess. Who's their enemy? Who's everyone running from? The Babylonians. So Pharaoh Hopra, who Zedekiah was going to align himself with against the Babylonians, he has this other fellow come along, he runs to the Babylonians. And so it's an odd situation. So I sort of feel God has a sense of humour once again. So Hopra, though, he didn't give up. Over the next 2 years, in self-proclaimed exile, he appealed to his host, the Babylonians, and to the Greeks to assist him to reclaim the throne. So once again, we're going to turn to another clay tablet in history. This one's called BM 33041, again from the British Museum. And in this one, it's from Babylon. It records the campaign of King Nebuchadnezzar against Egypt in his 37th year of reign. And it confirms that both the Babylonians and the Greeks from distant regions amidst the sea assisted the deposed Hopra to fight against his usurper, Pharaoh Amasis II. And it reads, in the 37th year, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, marched against Egypt to deliver a battle. There's Amasis, so this is in the Babylonian record, of Egypt, called up his army from the town Putu Laman, distant regions which are situated on islands, so this is how we know that the Greeks, amidst the sea. Many, this is because of the translation, which or who are in Egypt, carrying weapons, horses and chariots. He called up to assist him. He put his trust, and then the rest of this is actually missing. But this excerpt talks about this situation where we've got the one pharaoh coming against the other, and Nebuchadnezzar gets involved to help. So the word of the Lord came to the prophet Ezekiel. So we're going to come back to the Bible now. To the prophet Ezekiel, who was in Babylonian exile. So if you can go to the book of Ezekiel, we're going to go to chapter 30, and we're going to have a look at verses 2 to 3 and then verses 10 to 11. I will put this up on the board. I do have this as a screen to be viewed. And so it starts off, the Lord is sovereign, and he specifically declares what will be done by the hand of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon. And so just reading it through, it says, I will destroy the idols and put an end to the images in Memphis. I'm not sure where to stand here. So Memphis is here. So it specifically mentions Memphis. No longer will there be a prince in Egypt, and I will spread fear throughout the land. I will lay waste Upper Egypt, all this region, set fire to Zone, the Nile Delta, and inflict punishment on Thebes. So this is down here in the Upper Egypt. I will pour out my wrath on Pelusium, which is basically the entrance point into the territory of Egypt on the border of the Mediterranean Sea, the stronghold of Egypt, and that's why they call it the stronghold, because it's the place where they defend, that's where the highway comes in, and cut off the hordes again at Thebes. I will set fire to Egypt, Pelusium will writhe in agony, Thebes will be taken by storm, Memphis will be in constant distress. The young men of Heliopolis, which is here, Heliopolis, by the way, is the city of On, which is where Joseph lived when we go back in the scripture. The young men of Heliopolis and Bubastis here will fall by the sword, and the cities themselves will go into captivity. Dark will be the day at Tahpanhes, which is what we mentioned already earlier, when I will break the yoke of Egypt. There her proud strength will come to an end. She will be covered with clouds, and her villages will go into captivity. So I will inflict punishment on Egypt, and they will know that I am the Lord. And so Ezekiel is in Babylon. Where was Pharaoh Hopra? Where did he go to? He went to Babylon to ask for help. And so we find the prophecy comes from the location, from the prophet, where he is. It's very clever, isn't it, once you start putting the pieces together. So in 568 BC, in the 37th year of King Nebuchadnezzar's reign, the Babylonian king called up his army, and many Greek soldiers from the islands in the Aegean Sea joined them. The joint armies made their way south with Hopra through Hattilam, which is where the kingdom of Judah is. They travelled down the way of the sea and passed by the now desolate province of Judea. Then they travelled down the way of Horus that followed the edge of the Mediterranean Sea across the top of the Sinai Peninsula. Once they crossed the Wadi, or the river of Egypt, they continued westwards across the top of the Sinai Peninsula until they came to the Nile Delta at Pelusium. The Lord God used Nebuchadnezzar to pour out his wrath. So we're just sort of going to put this in order, what Ezekiel says, on Pelusium, and then left them to writhe in agony. A path of destruction followed in his wake. After Migdol, he broke the yoke of Egypt at Tahpanhes and slaughtered the Jews who had fled from the province of Judea after his governor Gedaliah had been killed. Why do we know that? Because the prophecy said they were going to put the stones underneath the pavers, and they were going to come into the city gates, and he would put his canopy over there and he would destroy the place. Okay? Egypt's strength was brought to an end. Now, we mentioned the prince, no more prince. So Egypt's strength was brought to an end. So in other words, there's no more ruler. Okay, that was the palace. To the king of Babylon set fire to Zone. The young men of Bubastis fell by the sword, as did those at Heliopolis, before he set fire to the temples of the gods of Egypt. And in Jeremiah 43, verse 13, sorry, we're bouncing back to Jeremiah. You'll have to bring like 3 or 4 bookmarks in future, I think. So Jeremiah 43, verse 13, just one verse, says, "There in the temple of the sun in Egypt, he will demolish the sacred pillars and will burn down the temples of the gods of Egypt." So Jeremiah speaks into this as well. Following the Nile River further south, he destroyed the idols and put an end to the images in Memphis, and more Jews were slaughtered. So in other words, these Jews were in various locations down the Nile. This continued on as the Babylonian army followed the Nile River further south, ever so deeper into the kingdom of Egypt. Fear spread throughout the land, and the armies passed through into Upper Egypt. They took Thebes by storm. They inflicted punishment and cut off the hordes at Thebes. But before coming to a halt at Aswan, they slaughtered the Jews amongst the population, remember we spoke about this, who lived on Elephantine Island in the middle of the Nile River. Remember what happened there? They built a replica of the Temple of Jerusalem. So when God sent Nebuchadnezzar down and all of this happened to Egypt, history says what happened to Egypt. But the reason that he went down was he was slaughtering the Jews in all the locations that they were living along the way. That's why it happened. Okay? So this island marked the southern border with Cush. Babylonia's campaign, of course, came to an end. In other words, the job was done. The Jews in the land of Egypt were slaughtered. The prophecy was fulfilled. So King Nebuchadnezzar, being a Babylonian king, they didn't stay and occupy anything. They went, they plundered, and they went back home again. And so he turned around. And if we go to Jeremiah 43 again, verse 12, it actually says, "As a shepherd wraps his garment around him, so will he wrap Egypt around himself and depart from there unscathed." So in other words, he didn't lose any battles. He didn't lose any men. He conquered Egypt. He deposed Hophra, who protected the Jews, and they fulfilled the Lord's work. And that was the purpose. And so he returned home unscathed, and the purpose of Babylonia's campaign was fulfilled. So judgment on the Jews who fled to Egypt was executed. Hophra was taken back. The word of the Lord given by the prophet Jeremiah was also about to be fulfilled. So if we go to Jeremiah 44, the next chapter, and you go to verse 30, it says, "I am going to hand Pharaoh Hophra, king of Egypt, over to his enemies who seek his life." So again, prophetic word of the Bible before it happened. Now, in the Cairo Museum, there's a large stela of rose-coloured granite. A stela is a stone object where they would carve images in or text into it, of rose-coloured granite known as the Elephantine stela. Originally it was found as part of a doorway for a house in Cairo, so whoever had it. It is unfortunately very worn because of this, but the portion that follows has been safely translated. And so I will put that up. Oh, there's the map again, sorry. There's a slightly larger map. So you can see all these locations all the way down to Aswan. Okay, so here's a bust of Amasis II. Here's a bust of Hophra. He's also known as Apries, A-P-R-I-E-S. He has another name, depending on the language. So in other words, these guys are real. They were real pharaohs of Egypt. The Bible once again mentions their names and what happens, and history supports it. So I'll just change sides over here. This is what the stela reads in the Cairo Museum. "In the 3rd year as king of Egypt, Amasis finds Apries, or Hophra, advancing against him from the north with a force of Greeks and a fleet. Hophra assumed the offensive and advanced to the vicinity of Sais, where Amasis, having mustered his forces, met and defeated him. The army of Hophra was scattered, but the dethroned king escaped, and his troops continued to rove the north, infesting the roads and of course living by plunder. Meantime, Hophra was a fugitive with a few Greek ships. When 4 or 5 months passed in this way, Amasis was obliged to dispatch his forces to exterminate the remnant of Hophra's army, and while this went on, Hophra was slain." So, this is after Nebuchadnezzar has been all the way down to Aswan and back and killed the Jews. Hophra was still alive, and so this stele tells you what happened to fulfill the prophetic word of the Lord through Jeremiah. He had a scattered army. He survived for a few more months, and eventually Amasis caught up with him and killed him. And thus the prophecy of Jeremiah was fulfilled. So in 567 BC, after the Babylonians left Egypt, Pharaoh Amasis II was confronted by the deposed Pharaoh Hophra and his foreign mercenary army, as this mentions. Hophra was first defeated and later killed, fulfilling the word of the Lord given by the prophet Jeremiah. And on that note, we come to a conclusion. This is all happening while Shealtiel is in Babylon. And so God is about his business. In other words, the exiles have been taken, but the remnant was still there. They disobeyed God. They went south to Egypt, so God sent Nebuchadnezzar after them. Okay? During the same time as Shealtiel's early life, Nebuchadnezzar was put in a situation where he had a vision from the Lord, didn't understand it. Daniel translated it, and God subjugated him from being an all-powerful, prideful king who believed in the god Marduk to acknowledging that the God of Israel was the God of heaven. And as a consequence of that, Nebuchadnezzar's actions fulfilling Jeremiah's words from the Lord came to pass, not just in the Bible, but in documented history which supports the truth of the Bible. And so this is the first portion of the journey of Shealtiel. Now, this lesson will have two more portions during the life of Shealtiel. Okay? Because the next person in the genealogy of Jesus is Zerubbabel, who will be returned with the exiles back to the land of Judah. Okay? So I hope you've been able to take all that in. We're going to spend a lot of time with the books of the prophets, because this is where we learn so much more about what's actually going on. And of course, I'm going to fill in the blanks with historical evidence that supports the truth of the Bible. Very important, because many people like to say that the Bible is a made-up book of fairy tales. And of course, history bears out the complete opposite. So the ignorance of people, if they choose to go to museums, for example, they'll actually find out that if they read their Bible and go to a museum, they can actually cross-reference what it actually says. So on that note, we'll just put up our end screen as we draw to a close. If you'd like to watch this lesson again, you can watch it back on Facebook, where it's been broadcast at the moment. The lesson will be edited and have all of the scriptures put on the screen, and you can view that on our YouTube channel if you type in Paul Brunton, the Jesus Movement, and you can subscribe there. And also the videos are placed onto our website at thejesusmovement.com.au. So thank you for joining us. God bless you, and we look forward to your company next time.